Welcome everyone. This is our sixth panel. I promise you it's going to be one of the most interesting ones. We have with us Kamal Douray from the Institut Français du Proche-Orient. Kamal will be presenting the case of the Zaatari camp, rethinking the camp through refugee socio-spatial practices. And we also have from UCL, Samar Makusi, and Samar will be presenting the case of Burj al-Barajni, Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut. And her presentation will be on designing time as a mode of recovery and vitality. I think both presentations, they're projecting, starting with the Kamal, who will be looking at how the Syrian refugee camp of Zaatari is being established and maybe projecting on the evolution of such a setting into a case of informality or complex urban refugee setting of what we have now with the Palestinian refugees in Beirut. So I'll give the floor for Kamal. Since Elena cannot make it with us today, so both presenters can have 25 minutes, and then we will have room for about 30 or 35 minutes of questions and answers.
No, just to change the system. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'm really happy to participate to this city debate. That is always a very interesting and stimulating place for us to think about cities. And well, today my presentation will be on the Jordanian context, and more specifically on Zaatari refugee camp that most of you know. It's one of the biggest Syrian refugee camp in the region. It's the biggest refugee camp in Jordan, and it has been created in 2012, in July 2012, when a lot of Syrians arrived in Jordan. Well, refugee camps cover today different realities in the Middle East, and ranging from the last traces of Armenian camps in the suburbs of Beirut to dense, informal urban settings of Palestinian camps all over the region. More recently, camps have been set up in Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey to host Syrian refugees. They were built on a temporary basis, and refugee camps tends to become permanent structures, and some of them turn into urban settlements. And this is step by step the case of the Syrian camps in the region, and more specifically in Jordan. Camps are originally conceived and designed to implement operational management of humanitarian assistance and to facilitate the control of refugee population. On the long term, they tend to become spaces of marginalization and marked by high level of poverty, but also places that symbolize and represent the specific history of the refugees in exile. This double dimension, material and symbolic, is inherent of the existence of camps in protracted situation. So the presentation today will try to explore how can we qualify these spaces that are subject to specific legal regimes and whose inhabitants, when they are themselves refugees, have a legal status that limits their access to property, to the labor market, to health, and to education. So if we take it from a morphological point of view, the camps are similar to most of the informal settlements of the main cities in the Middle East. But new forms of social spatial practices emerge in the camp, combining a reconstruction of home abroad with constraints linked to camp management. So this presentation is based on a 3 years research in Zaatari when I was based at the French Institute in Amman. So it's a collective work that we did with a team of architects and other social scientists. Well, First of all, this is a picture we took in 2016 of Zaatari camp. And it's one of the classical perception that we have of the camp. I mean, something that from above, that we take a picture. It's a place of settlement that we can call a makeshift city. And it has been transformed, and we still see some presence of tents to like a precarious form of housing. So this is a classical way. I mean, whether we take a picture from above, whether we take a picture from this overall setting of kind of urban setting that is now Zaatari. Well, I will try in this presentation to change a little bit the focus, to try to rethink, as it was mentioned in this panel, and to try to see, to go beyond this perception, and to introduce the perception of the refugees themselves and their own perception of the place they have contributed to develop. So I will explore two main dimensions. First of all, and it connects us to what has been said just before by Lorraine Lando, it's to connect time and mobility. I mean, camps are not isolated space, and they are not disconnected from their overall development. There was something before, there will be something after, and refugees are not immobile. They are not just settled somewhere, but they just, so first of all, I will try to understand this connection between migration, time, and camp settlement. And on a second aspect I want to focus on today is to try to concentrate on another scale of analysis. I don't want to take the camp as a whole, I mean at the macro level, but try to understand it at the scale of the individuals, of the families. And so to try to see, as it have been done here, for example, on Beirut, to see refugees as city makers. So to try to see how do they produce, but from their perception and at the scale of the houses and of the families. So first, on mobility and settlement. So to introduce the question of time, some of the interviews we conducted, so we conducted many interviews with refugees inside the camp and outside the camp in Jordan, of Syrian refugees. And what was extremely interesting is to see that the camp is often just a time or a step into an overall journey, an overall migration process. So it's not only a place of settlement, the camp, it's a place where people transit, and the vast majority of refugees, of Syrian refugees in Jordan, have transited through camps. Different kind of camps. There was three kind of camps. There were entry camps, like Rashid, in the northeast of Jordan. And then you have registration camps, where people are registered with the UNHCR and with the local administration. And then settlement camp, or that should be considered, Zaatari camp is considered as to be a place where people settle. But if you take this into numbers, we have like 630,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan. Only 15% of them are living in one of the three refugee camps. But more than half of the refugees have transited through Zaatari refugee camp. So it's a place that is something that structures the mobility of the Syrian refugees in Jordan. So this camp is a transit place. And in this transit place, people use it to reconnect to different places. And so they reorganize their solidarity network in this place. They reconnect and they connect to Jordanian society to find a kafil, for example, to be able to go out of the camp. And so the camp is a place where networks are reconstructed. So it has a huge importance in structuring the overall mobility of Syrian refugees in Jordan. And also, the people in the camp, they go out for family visits. They go out during specific periods like Ramadan or Eid. They go out to work, for example, in the agriculture on a seasonal basis. So it's a place where people go out and go in. It's not, even if it seems to be like a closed entity, it's completely connected with the economy, and it's completely connected with other locations in Jordan, such as Amman, such as Mafraq, that is the closest city. It's 12 kilometers away from Za'atari, and it's a city that has doubled its number of inhabitants with the arrival of Syrian refugees. So it's completely connected in terms of economy, in terms of visits, in terms of connecting different kind of spaces. And also, it's a place where people reconnect and develop even transnational connections. And this is extremely crucial to understand the role of the camp in organizing further migration and further mobility of Syrian refugees. This camp is completely connected, for example, to Syria. And people exchange a lot with their Syrian family stayed in Syria, but also with a lot of transnational connections abroad. Those who have already emigrated towards Germany, towards Sweden, towards European countries, or even elsewhere. So it's extremely interesting and important to have in mind that the camp is not a place only of settlement. It's not a geographically bounded space, but it's a completely transnational space, and people go through this camp and reconnect with the rest of the Syrian society. So this was one of the first focus I wanted to emphasize today. Then the camp in itself. Let's get inside the camp and try to understand it from the point of view of the refugees themselves. At first, I wanted to say that showing these pictures that we took in Za'atari, and one of the pictures that was taken by one of my colleagues when we were working in Syria before the year 2011, we see some similarities in terms of architecture. So despite the fact that the camp is built by international organization, that the humanitarian government is extremely strong, that Jordanian authorities put a lot of limits and constraints on the question of how they can develop their own housing, refugees have completely tried to circumvent all these different kind of constraints and try to recreate some forms of traditional architecture that they had. And for example, this kind of wall is a structure that is completely classic, that you see traditionally in southern Syria, and to delimit, to put the borders around a private space, they tend to reproduce what was their form of settlement in Syria before they left. And even in terms of informality and the shape of informal housing inside the camp, you can see down, it's a study that has been done by Etienne Lena and a group of architects in Syria on informality and informal neighborhoods in the suburbs of Damascus. And you can see some of the mapping that we did inside Za'atari, and it's quite similar. The shape of the inhabitants, the shape that the inhabitants gave to their own housing, with this central courtyard, with this madafe, with the kitchen and so on and so forth, and to try to delimitate a private space in a place where you don't have any private space. I mean, private space has not been thought by international organization when they designed Za'atari refugee camp, and even when they designed the other camps in Jordan. And that is quite interesting to see that it's one of the first thing that refugees have tend to develop, is to try to recreate a private space when in this kind of overall big refugee camp. So refugees are really actors, and they develop skills, and they reuse skills that they had previously in Syria to develop their own housing and settlement in Za'atari camp. So there is this kind of relation between something that is designed by international organization and what Michel Agier called the humanitarian government, and what is done by the refugees themselves while structuring their housing in the camp. This is one example that we studied in order just to show you the way it has developed since the creation of the camp and the first settlement of one of the refugees family that we worked with during 3 years. They had a single tent, and then step by step, they bought new caravans, they developed their own housing in order to really recreate a private space. And what is very interesting is that the first thing that they have created, and I will just look deeper on this aspect later on in my presentation, is that they have really focused on first the madafe to receive people from outside. So it's a place where you can socialize, a place where you can receive people from outside. And when you are in a camp like this, they receive like nearly on a daily basis international organization that comes to see what are their needs and so on and so forth. And so they try to have a place where they can receive people. They try to develop a small garden, if you see on the third step. It's a very small garden. It's not, I mean, it's not used like, it's not like they don't have money to buy food. It's not like but it's an issue of trying to really reproduce what they had previously in Syria and to try to have like a space that they appropriate as such. And then they try to develop also forms of kitchens. So they really reshape completely the material that they have. But you have to have in mind that they are not allowed to bring material from outside. So bringing material from outside the camp is not allowed. So it's an extremely complex process of reusing, reshaping humanitarian material in order to bring it from one use that was designed by the international organization to another use that is developed by the refugees themselves. So this is, and I will go now a little bit in details in some of these different aspects. So if you look at, for example, the kitchen, we have like common structures that have been developed when the camp was created in 2012. The first thing that they did, that they created collective kitchens because there was only tents. And one of the first things that the refugees did is to create their own kitchen. And if you can see, there is a real design of the kitchen. It's not something that they just did for practical reasons, but it becomes like a place of life. It becomes like a place of you recreate your family life around cooking. That is one of the only activity that they have because they are not allowed to work or with very limited opportunities. And yet you spend the whole day in the camp, and you stay the whole day in a place where you don't have public space. So they recreated. And you have 3 different kinds of models or patterns of kitchens that has been recreated. And it's a real place that is invested by refugees. It's a very symbolic investment. And they recreate like traditional Syrian cuisine, ways of receiving people in the madafe. I mean, cooking and receiving people is becoming like a very structured activity in the camp. Then I took, it's not like to be provocative, it's not to provoke but this, I wanted to put in parallel these 2 different pictures that I took. On the top, you have the infrastructure that are developed by the UNHCR and all the different international organizations. The first one is a school inside the camp. So it's a completely closed and disconnected area. It's like it's receiving refugees, but it's completely disconnected. It's not like it's a public space, but it's completely closed. So there is a camp inside the camp. So this is quite interesting to see how do they disconnect their own administration and activities from the daily life of the refugees. And the second one is the base camp. You can see the refugees trying to connect with the wireless system. So that's why they just are close to but this is where UNHCR have its administration. So also it's inside the camp, and it's completely disconnected from the camp. It's completely closed. Refugees are not allowed to get in and out. And even if it's not really allowed to take pictures. But, and you can see on the opposite what the refugees themselves developed. That's I wanted to put like in contrast the way to try to rethink the camp through the lens and through the perception of the refugees themselves. The first thing that they develop is like open gardens. They try to plant trees and to have like an open area where they can gather, where they can exchange, where they can cross, and don't want to be like they try to recreate public spaces. And I think that in contrast with what is developed by international organization, it's interesting to see this huge contrast when you leave the refugees themselves, recreate their own space, the way they oppose it completely to the model that is created by the international organization. And the second one is a madafe that is also a central place together. It means that these spaces were not designed in the camp. It was like a pure humanitarian. And Zaatari is conceived like a model. It's a model because in terms of humanitarian needs, there is no problem. You have schools, you have now electricity, you have water, you have a sewage system, you have hospitals, you have everything for your needs. You can find it in the camp. But the social dimension of recreating a society, of recreating a social space, recreating public space, recreating spaces where people gather, meet, this was absolutely not designed, especially in this like community-based organization that is completely built by international organization. Another very interesting picture is something that we can see also here in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and that we can see also in many places in Amman, is a kashash hammam. So it's the way people recreate social practices. I was the first one to be extremely surprised that even in Zaatari, and I took this picture, I think, in 2015 or 2016, I don't remember, so it was like 3 to 4 years after people arrived. But they were trying to recreate and to redevelop Syrian practices, Syrian urban practices. It's a completely urban practice to have this kashash hammam. And they really tried to redevelop it on the top of these caravans. And it was not, I mean, this is one example, but there was so many in the camps showing what kind of creation the refugees themselves want to build in exile. So let's move a little bit from a pure settlement needing humanitarian needs in the case of a crisis, and go a little bit to the forms of creation of social practices or recreation of social practices in exile. The last element I wanted to develop is the emergence of a public space, a real public space where people can walk. The camp was absolutely not designed to have like all these is informal. All these was not accepted. It's only tolerated by international organization and Jordanian authorities. There are like 3,000 shops inside this city. The city is around 75,000 inhabitants now. And they developed a lot of different places where people can gather outside, can recreate forms of social life, recreate things that seems to be useless in the refugee camp. So it's just like on the left, it's people selling perfume, but Syrians are very famous to do these perfumes in Syria before, and hairdresser and so on and so forth. So I have a lot of examples. I just put 3, but it's interesting to see that things that could be thought as useless, as the things that are created by the refugees themselves, because there is a social utility of this kind of perception. And this is, the contrast is a little bit harsh, but I thought it was interesting to show it because I was really surprised myself. On the left, it's the World Food Programme Distribution Center. So it looks like not really a distribution center for food. And in contrast, on the left, it's a restaurant developed by the refugees themselves. So I thought that it was quite interesting to meet the same needs, giving food. Or it's interesting to see how it is designed on a very, 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 I prefer not to, I don't know how, it looks more like a market for animals than something that to distribute food. So it's interesting, I wanted to end on this picture to see the difference in contrast of meeting the same needs and seeing how can refugees develop their own way of doing it and how international organizations are shaping it in a completely different perception. And thank you.
Can I put this here? أكتب بنزل بهاي. No. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure, like, if I'm too loud, let me know to step away a bit. Thank you so much for including me, Huwaida, and Dabir, and everyone that has worked to make this happen. I know it's been a lot of work, so thank you so much, and being on top of things, even the last minute. Today I'm going to talk about something that actually, in a way, sits very well or transitions very well from what Kamal has presented. So thanks for giving me a lot of to continue this. In fact, Kamal and I are sort of intellectual colleagues, so it feels like we're still having a dialogue about this idea of how camps really are created and evolve, and looking at it from the people who inhabit that space, regardless of what we want to call them right now. Because I think what was very striking, in a way, what you ended with is really our question, what we are starting with. So, Kamal spoke about the public spaces that have been created, and these I call social spaces or social constructs. And the last image, I think, was very striking to see how humanitarianism imagines and designs social spaces, but then on the opposite side, the people that actually live in the camps, how they imagine and how they create and construct these social spaces. And this is, in a way, part of the research that I was involved in, which is about this evolution of space, but taking into consideration, whether it's private, public, social, what does it mean when it's in a displaced geography, like a camp, like informal settlement. So just to say a few words about what we're going to talk about, this presentation is a combination of two sort of questionings or interests from myself and Nick Tyler, who unfortunately could not be here. Nick, which you will find his bio in the book, which doesn't do justice because Nick is someone who is just really a pleasure to meet and talk to because you learn so much from him. But Nick is interested in time from a perspective of cities and urbanity, and I was interested in time from the perspective of refugee camps. So in a way we combined, louder? No. Oh, sorry. So in a way we combined both forces to think time across these different geographies. So our presentation is titled Designing Time as a Mode of Recovery and Vitality. And I really hope that you guys will take it as a preliminary questioning of time in an area called Burj al-Barajne, which we'll talk about more. But this is preliminary work, so any advice, any provocation, any sort of challenge that you might offer us would be absolutely welcome. And Nick and I are doing this work as part of the Relief Center, which I think many of you have probably already heard about, but we're hoping that we're going to be able to really take research on the ground in a different direction. So maybe let me just talk about the work a bit. So the work is a combination of two questionings, as I said, from myself and Nick about time, whereby we were each wondering about the role of time in designing space, or better yet, the role of time when thinking of space, both designing it and constructing it. The latter is where we met intellectually. While Nick was interested in understanding how people negotiate time in a city, I was involved in understanding how the displaced, particularly the Palestinian refugees, which is really my specific area of work and interest, were negotiating their time in the camp. So though it plays a real and crucial part in understanding time in a Palestinian camp, but the notion of return, which a lot of us associate with Palestinians in terms of how they decide life, how they decide building space, how they decide, in a way, their identity, is the notion of return, the right of return. So though that's a very, very crucial thing to think about, it was not our departing point for us to understand time in the camp. But for both of us, it was more about the negotiation that takes place in the mind of the human, about the reasons, and in the camp they're very much associated with need, because as also Kamal showed, these social spaces, whether it's kashash hammam or whether it's the hairdresser or whatever, these come out of a need. Need is not only providing more space or room to live in, or need are also social and economic. So even though they emanate from a need, but then there's a creative act right after that. And that's where I think we see these forms of the people on the ground making, and this is what provokes us as researchers, I think. So they emanate from a need of investing in space, meaning investing in time, which we will elaborate more upon here. But here I invite you to translate the word invest beyond its physical form and more towards an investment in and around space, which in reality is, in a way, spending time. So a lot of these images, if we think about them, they are about spending time, whether spending time together, whether spending time on your own, spending time with other elements, animals. But this idea of spending time is actually very, very spatial as well, and we'll talk about that more. In fact, maybe the madafa is it's true, the madafa, and unfortunately I don't have slides to really show you the evolution of the Palestinian camp, but in some ways it resonates, or the Syrians' treatment of the evolution of their spaces resonates with the Palestinian history as well. Very different geographies of displacements and times, so we can argue that they can be very different as well. But the Madafi room, which is the public, the social space, is also something that the Palestinians constructed early on as well. And the reason I think these social constructs happened very early on is because the camps are designed whereby they're very limiting in terms of the social constructs. And the collective spaces in the camp are usually very much related to amenities, whether it's the distribution, whether it's the water, whether it's the... So it's about sort of like this mechanical operation. You go, you get something, basic needs in a way. It's related to basic needs, to survival. And that's the collective, that's the public scale from the onset in the camps. And what refugees and the people of the camp do is pretty much challenge this and construct their own collective scales in the forms of all these different rooms or spaces. So this image right here, which I captured recently in Burj al-Barajneh, it says يمنع التواجد لغير أبناء الحارة اللي مش من الحارة يمنع الجلوس. So pretty much presence not allowed for those, not sons of the neighborhood. And here we can even talk about which hara, what neighborhood, how far does it go. Whoever is not from the neighborhood, seating is prohibited. And what really attracted me is the word yumna julus, because julus is sitting, and julus is pretty much, for me, the first public notion of space. Because even when you sit in a camp, if you spend time in a camp, if you start sitting alone, within half an hour, you're pretty much a collective scale. There's going to be a lot of friends, a lot of people coming in and creating, a dialogue, a conversation space. So the form or the act of sitting is what provoked me that are they saying no more social constructs, or are they trying to define something beyond just the sitting? So we're interested in the social constructs of time. And in fact, I think what is happening here is a form of boundary making, and it's communicated through walls, and the description of what's inside and what's outside is in the form of this sitting, which is sharing time. So, as many of us know, obviously, the camp is not just a camp. The camp is beyond the camp and in relation to the camp. So for us, the departing point was, okay, we start from the camp as a moment of time, but let's understand how this time evolved as well spatially. So in the built environment, this is a picture of Burj Al Barajne. I'm not going to tell you which side is camp and which side is not, but it's pretty much a dividing or an adjoining, I'm not sure what you want to call it, but it's a line that divides and adjoins at the same time, and we'll talk about that further. But the built environment camouflages what's a camp and what is not a camp. Yet the social identification of the physicality of that defining line, identified as one of camp and not camp, is repeatedly emphasized. If you try today to go to this street, and if, both sides can understand, first of all, if you're from that area, from a camp or from not a camp, and in a way, your association socially. It's always emphasized to me when I'm taking a picture, which is also not easy to take pictures in these spaces, that this side is a camp, we're not a camp. So socially, it's always emphasized. So while the body's material, meaning the people inhabiting the built environment, insist on retaining a divide, the built material of infrastructure and cement have converged over time, achieving what we can call shared time. And I don't know if it matters to know which one is a camp and which one is not, but that side is a camp and this side is not a camp. Yet it's extremely difficult from the physical environment to understand that these spaces could be so well connected physically, even the wires are connected. This is another issue of talking about how infrastructure really connects before, in a way, social bodies. But when you inhabit or just experience the space, it's very clear that the social conversion has not happened yet. So in some ways, we can say that the bodies are insisting on retaining separate times. And this is sort of just moving in up the street. On this side, also, this side, you have the Burj Al Barajne Lebanese area, predominantly, if not all, Shia. And then on the other side is the camp. And this is, in a way, the contact point. Again, I think maybe you can read a little bit into the picture, and I'm sorry the picture is not very clear, but it's hard to take pictures openly there. Hopefully I can build trust enough to do that one day. But it's obvious that there is sort of these nodes of social gatherings rather than it's a or homogeneous social spatiality, and this is in a way what we're interested in. If the physicality is not able to construct these social spaces or behaviors, cement is not able to do it, infrastructure is not able to do it, then what can? And this is when we turn to the concept of time. So to speak a little bit about this concept of time, and here I'm going to borrow from, this is, I think, a book that probably many of you know about, The Physicist and the Philosopher, Einstein and Bergson, the debate that happened in Paris in 1922. Jimena Canales, who is a science historian, I guess, is the best way to describe her, opens her book with this paragraph, which I thought was extremely telling. And she says, Einstein met a man he would never forget. He was one of the most celebrated philosophers of the century, widely known for espousing a theory of time that explained what clocks did not: memories, premonitions, expectations, and anticipations. Thanks to him, we now know that to act on the future, one needs to start by changing the past. And we'll expand on this more. But this idea about reading time and understanding time beyond measurement, which I think is pretty much what Einstein, in a way, theory of relativity was about, measuring time. And Bergson, for him, was time is something beyond just measurement, beyond units. And this is what I think the conflict between the two, it started there. But at the same time, Jimena reminds us that this debate on time actually started back in 1911 in Bologna, in a scientific congress of philosophers that Bergson attended, but a physicist called Paul Langevin in some ways stole the show. Why? Paul developed what's called a twin paradox, and this is actually an interesting story. So Paul tells the story of two twin brothers. One got on a spaceship and traveled the speed of light away from Earth. And what happened is actually he was aging slower as time accelerated. So when he came back, his twin was aged and he wasn't. And he even talks about this fountain of youth where to stay young, he says a person has to remain agitated, so in a way remaining fast. And it's a very interesting description of how time is lived in the camp. I mean, every time I am with my friends in the camp or with my colleagues in the camp, it's true, there is always this moment of urgency, or this feeling of urgency when we discuss time, when we discuss the camp, when we discuss the future, or in relation to the past. So I think urgency in some ways can be related to this agitation that Langevin talks about. But for Bergson, he refutes this. Bergson sees the other twin as a phantom, the one that remains on Earth. So keeping all this debate about time in mind, how can we then reimagine the Dahya map to convey what Bergson is concerned with, that is memories, premonitions, expectations, and anticipations? So this is just something I've been working on to try and unfold the spatiality of Dahya. I know, I'm speaking to people who already know a lot of this. So, but maybe just to give an idea of what this layer is talking about. So in blue, Dahya has, a long history. A lot of the people here, Muna Harb, writes about the history of Dahya. So we all know how interesting and conflictual the history of Dahya is. But what's really interesting about Dahya today, and in relation to time, is the spatial forms are actually very many and very diverse. So you have the refugee camps, who are one of the earliest spatial forms, by the way, in Dahya. These camps are from the 1948 camps. So in a way, they were presets for a lot of space that came afterwards. And then you also, from the civil war, from the multiple Israeli invasions, you have the Lebanese, Shia mainly, coming into Dahya, creating informality. And actually, the relationship between the specific site I was talking about, the camp, and the informality, that street was not so intimate. That street started much further, but what they described to me is that each community, in a way, started building closer and closer and closer until they came to that distance. And in some ways, what does this distance mean? Why didn't it go beyond this line? But this was not built right away. This was also years and time of histories of things, of memories, of premonitions, of investment, of perceptions that built this now dividing, in a way, scale, that width. So for me, can we actually read Dahya in terms of time scales rather than physical scales? We understand that, and we can see some of even the formal scales here, which were reconstruction areas. So this encounter of these different spatial scales of camp, informal, formal, within one area, who share time. Can this be then translated into, and when I say share time, it's not just current, it's past, it's future. Can it be translated into time scales? And this is what we are in a way suggesting. Let's read the map of Dahya in terms of time and in terms of the encounter of the formal, the informal, and the camp. So I'm going to talk, Nick and I have been talking about this at the time, and he mentioned that he had this Clough clock that he owns, a very old clock. And when he mentioned it, I said, we have to have a slide on this, just because I think it provides a very relational metaphor. So the Clough clock can host different scales and forms of time within one body. Thus, they work in harmony without losing their distinct time scales. And Nick was able to send me the images of the clock, which I'll show in a minute. But as he sent images, he also sent me this comment that I thought, it would be very nice to share, especially that he wasn't able to be present, but it's very interesting, and I quote. He says, interesting to consider the metaphysics of the mechanics. If you imagine each of these times, so these are the times that one clock can convey and relate and show. So if you imagine each of these times is displaced using a cog driven from a single pendulum, you have cogs with different numbers of teeth and ratio of 12 for the hours, 60 for the minutes, 365 for the sunrise, 59 for the moon, 31 for the dates, and 27 and a bit for the Sumerian bit. He continues. This is the clock. It's from 1745. He continues. So from one pulse, you can have many different times going on at the same time. Or what is time anyway, as they are all time? Of course, the changes from one to the other have to be affected by other cogs. So there is also a question of direction. Time seems to go backwards, but in reality, it only goes forwards. And as Bergson stated, it's irreversible. So much for the clockwork universe. So what we have here actually is an image from the site we're talking about, or closer to the site, the street. And for me now, if we want to sort of translate what we're talking about in a more physicality, materiality on the site, this is an encounter of 3 different time scales or 3 different time materials. So what you have actually over there, where behind the lady, is one of the first, the Barrakiye, or the first unit that the refugees built in Burj al-Barajne from a humanitarian scale. And then next to it, you have pretty much the evolution into cement. So this is, in a way, the current material, though it's also still hasn't developed into the verticality that we see. And behind it, you have a wall, which is pretty much, the texture is left from the War of the Camps. And it's not camp, it's outside of the camp. But these encounters of material around the site are many. And what they have in them that's extremely interesting is a revealing of the age of the material. So there is time in material and bodies. It's not just bodies. So in some ways, this is an amazing illustration of how material decays together and also starts creating a shared time that's very much about what the material itself experienced. So you're reading, in a way, the narrative of each material, of each wall, but they are all bounded together within one history, within one time. So I think this is one of the very interesting images to think about, this concept of time within the physicality of that site. At the end of the day, we are architects and urban designers. This is probably going to be one of our first moments of insights into trying to understand, oh, there is a problem of time here. So let's think about it beyond just the cement. This is another example of things you see in those areas. So this is just a really haphazard illustration of whether it's graffiti or visuals, which are very numerous. I mean, you see them everywhere in Palestinian camps, and I'm sure in Zaatari camp there are some forms of these visual representations, whether they take the graffiti or they take the banners or they take something like this, which is an image of the apartheid wall in Israel. And this was taken last year, so it's very recent. And someone has very nicely, just put his own, in a way, representation visually of this. But it's a very spatial image, and it's an image that really conveys time as well in these areas. And we talked about this idea of return. But this image actually says, in some ways, I don't know if you can see them, but it's talking about time, saying we will return. So this emphasis on we will return is also very much revealing. And we will return does not mean I'm going to pack up my stuff right now and leave. But that means we will keep negotiating time. We're not settling time, just like we argue that they're not settling physicality. But I would actually think it's not the physical, it's not the cement and the infrastructure that we should be negotiating or asking about. It's the time that's being negotiated. And time is, in a way, what reflects and manifests in all these different forms, whether it's the physical, the social, the humanitarian, the political, the geopolitics, especially in these areas. So it's about, there is an insistence on negotiating time in these spaces. And the question is why and how? And what does it mean to the larger area beyond the camp? Especially in a protraction. So maybe just 2 things to also bring up so we can think about. 2 things here is perceptions of time, which Kemal also in a way talked about. We were very interested to know perceptions of time, not individually only, but as I showed you in Dahiyeh, Dahiyeh evolved in many ways through nodes of time, whether it was conflict, it was war, it was the Palestinian, it was the Israeli invasions, it was the war of the camps, or the internal strifes. So there are these nodes of times that created the habitat for these people. So these people will have different perceptions of time emanating from different moments of time departure, which are very much spatial. When you are displaced, whether it's a refugee or to another, within your country, to a different country, or whether it's an economic displacement, not just even a spatial war displacement, you're always in relation to that moment of time. But what does that relation really mean? And how can it be facilitated to create a mobile time or an active time rather than to be always treated in just a backwards relationship? We need to return to a first moment. I think the negotiation is saying we need to reconstruct that first moment, but that's also something we need to study and expand on and really understand. The other thing is obviously that's provoking in this image is the relationship of the current time and the future time as it exists today in that area. It's very difficult to talk about the present because as I'm talking about it, it's disappearing. But for us, maybe the current is something that's more telling. The present is always a future in the making, as Deleuze would say. And this is, in a way, why we think time is extremely important. Because if the present is the future in the making, you are making time. You are dealing with time. So to try and then force ourselves as spatial people to remap things and to really try and map time and try to even talk and speak and converse time with the people on the ground would, I think, be a very interesting new approach to understanding these displaced geographies and the protraction of them. Because as we know, protraction is time. We always measure the Palestinian problem as, it's been 50 years of occupied whatever. It's been 70 years. Even when they talk about inside Palestine, some people call it the occupied territory. Some people say, relate the creation of Israel to time as well. So it's been 50 years, it's been 70 years, but it also is, it's reflecting of the geography they're starting from. Some people consider the 67 as the geography of relating of the problem of Israel-Palestine. Others no, related to the 48. These are perceptions, and perceptions are extremely subjective, extremely personal, and we need to understand these perceptions to be able to understand what could be a shared time or a shared perception in a way. This is just another image which almost conveys the previous about the materiality and the aging of the materiality, and then also the response, how time also recreates material behavior. So this image over here shows actually the original material is that red sand that you're seeing. Burj al-Barajne was really just a red hill, sandy hill. But obviously over time, this also became solidified. There is no infrastructure in Burj al-Barajne. It's almost sitting on sand until today, which is something extremely compelling. But time, not only compacts in a way such space, but time is also compacting space. And this is in a way what we're provoking. And obviously on that side, we're seeing how new materials are coming in, and every material comes in with, in a way, a time or an age or of its own. Metal is coming in to try and obviously intervene in the wires. We'll see if it works. I don't think it would because I saw one going on fire the other day. I'm just going to end with this slide saying, because it was, as I was doing research and whatever, this came up and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I don't think about this that much. But the sun is actually 8 minutes and 20 seconds in the past. When we look at the sun today, if you go out, you're looking at 8 minutes and 20 seconds in the past. And that's something I think very important when we think about what are we looking at? How are we looking at time in spaces on Earth? Because yes, there is a scale of time. Time conveys a lot more than just measurement, and this is in a way what we're interested in. Thank you.
Thank you for two very interesting presentations. I will try to limit my time and my question, but really, like you highlighted keywords that I'll try to connect. Since again, the Za'atari is a representation or of how Burj used to be back in the time. So Kamal brought out the notion of spatial reproduction, the social fabric, the public spaces, and Samar also talked about basically about time and the notions of the return memories. For me, this all together develops the notion of identity. And I can maybe talk a bit on a research that I have been involved in since I've worked in Za'atari and Al Buruj and lately with the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. We looked into the impact of space on the mental health, well-being of refugees. And our assumption, the hypothesis was that a well-developed, nicely designed, semi-permanent structure will have a positive impact. It would reduce stress, reduce anxiety, even increase knowledge attainment, because we were looking at semi-permanent structure versus the tented structures. And when we got to to all the list of questions, looking again into the space itself, the children, the students, their parents, the teachers really scored high on like how positive the space have an impact when it comes to natural ventilation, natural lighting, the colors, and they were very disappointed with the tent structure. But still, we were shocked to see that within the research, we had very alarming figures when you look into the level of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety and depression. So this research was conducted with people from the Harvard program in refugee trauma and us as architects. When you ask more and when you hear the stories and the narrative that the refugees will tell you, the notion of the fragmented identity or the shattered identity becomes very much highlighted, and this is what I shared with Dr. Davis about also the notion of it could be something related to the negative resilience. So when we investigated more, and I will end it here, and I'm excited to hear your feedback on this, there are three key factors that contribute to this notion of shattered identities. First is the rights of the refugees, their legal rights, the human rights, basically the lack of rights. The second is the polarized political rhetoric. And the third dimension are the traumatic experiences. And when these three intersect, for me, they represent something similar to the rock wave effect. So the rock wave basically is that when you have within the sea, you have seismic pressures that produce three intersecting waves that hit one of the largest ships, and it basically shatters all the windows, all the glass, and it kills the people on board of the ship. So the shattering of the identities is very similar, in my perspective, to the three key factors behind the rock wave. Space is only one factor, and this is what research have shown us. So how can we envision an intervention that, again, looks into time as a source of building the identities into the legal rights, into the social fabric, to try to mitigate this very scary notion of the shattering of identities among the Palestinian refugees, the Syrian refugees, or any refugee within protracted crises.
Yeah, thanks a lot for these comments. I think that, well, if we, I think that one of the most problematic thing for the people inside Za'atari was this overall perception of the absence of perception, and this is linked to the rights mainly, to the absence of right. the absence of perception of, uh, of the future. I mean, the question of return is, of course, crucial. But still, the war is not finished in Syria, and still there is no possibility of safe return. And another aspect, the Jordanian authorities said clearly that there was no possibility of settling on the long term. And so this relation between, I mean, absence of right and the perception of time as being like always, I mean, there is no possibility to develop on long term, to have like a vision. And just to, and I think that it's quite interesting if we link it to what you said in your presentation, Borja Brajne. Well, when we were doing the interviews, like we were going like every 2-3 months to the same family during 3 years to try to understand the evolution of their housing. One of the thing that was said by one of our Syrian refugees that we work with was quite interesting, that he said that, well, we were trying to understand the logic, I mean, behind his development of housing as from the tent to this kind of new forms of shelter. And his perception of time was crucial in this, because he said that if I knew that I would have stayed like 7 years, I would have never done it this way. So it was like he was in a position where he couldn't know how long he will stay. At the end, he left anyway in France. So he left his structure and he left. But he was like doing things on a very, and it's like same thing for some of the Palestinians I worked with a long time ago. I mean, you just feel that it's not permanent. You're always doing something that, and you will be somewhere else. You don't know where. It can be like the return, it can be like re-emigration, it might be like being expelled, or the war will destroy it, or anything. And that you never have this perception, this feeling that you do something for good. You always do it, but you know that it's for a limited period of time. And it can, like, in the Palestinian camps I studied in South Lebanon, it's like 70 years.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add to that, I mean, the issue of identity is something that's also just like space, extremely, provocative and conflictual, that we keep researching and re-understanding in a way. But maybe one thing I've been noticing that the thing with the identity with the Palestinian refugee, and I think this is not just inside a camp or not, but inside the camp it's much more highlighted, and I think dense or in a way ما بعرف بس إنه هيك مأزم urgent. Is that there is, I mean, I think naturally people create a personal identity regardless of where you exist in the world. But for us, and especially in our culture, but that's not even just related to culture, I think this is just, and this is why we're interested in time as social constructs, there's always also this social identity that you create, and it's sort of like the collective identity. And if we want to try and imagine it in camps, whereby not only are they unstable spaces, but they are spaces always redefined because of the larger geopolitics. They're camps in transition, or the temporality is much more about the political resolutions around, rather than the temporality of the materiality of it. So, and these things, I mean, in reality, make changes inside the camp. They're not just, topics or negotiations that we hear about in the news or that politicians talk about, and they affect things on the ground. And we have examples of this. Obviously, even host countries, they're changing policies towards the camps affect things. In Lebanon, it has happened. In Jordan, it happens. Jordan is being completely reformed as camps. They're becoming neighborhoods with, in a way, rescaling camps, let's say. This type of stuff affects this shattered identity process. In a way, even if your personal identity remains somewhat stable, your external or your collective form of identity is in a way affected and always being moved, shaped or shattered or shaken. So I think this is part of why there is this always tension between trying to say what can be a Palestinian identity, Syrian identity today, or what, maybe.
Hi. A quick reflections on camps. Maybe it's basic, but camps, well, for me at least, camps are a product of a political decision to keep certain foreigner out. And usually they are poor foreigners. So it's an act of segregation bordering with imprisonment. It's a very horrible place to live in, camps. And in turn, camps breed frustration, social conservatism, fundamentalism, all these things. I always remember that when talking about camps, I always have in mind that the Taliban were created in Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. Anyway, this is my reflection, but I have a quick question. In Zaatari, where are the women? Thank you.
Okay, I'll throw in another question. I'd like to challenge a little bit this notion of time, Samar, if I may, because you made the statement that the time is not reversible and that there was somehow a linear construct that was presented. I think it was very convincing on the one hand, but it can be extended, I think, to challenging this notion of the linearity and the non-reversible, because if we consider time as a field of operation, like you showed with the spatial accumulation, if we go back to yesterday's discussion about unarchiving, we can think of time as something that we can recover, right? And we can reverse and we can reconstruct. Also, if we think of the imaginaries, the landscapes that we imagine, that use a different time construct, I think it would be interesting to expand this notion and think of what Omar Mismar showed us, what the archiving presentation showed us. And it can build on what you're saying fantastically, I think, to just go beyond that. It's a comment, you don't have to question.
So it was very interesting because the first presentation was more about spatial aspects and the next one on temporal. I just wanted to add one thing which I don't know if you looked at. There's this third dimension which kind of mixes with, combines together with spatial and temporal, and that's experiential. And the experiential is more with regards to different senses, like smell. So did you also kind of figure out how that dimension is reflected in these camps? That was one of my first questions. The second question was regarding, did you see the kind of changes that were there, kind of how people bring back their identity similar across different sections of people there? Or like, was it same, or did you see even differences depending on where they come from, what their background is? Could you see that differential kind of thing as well among the people you investigated in those camps? Thank
you. Yesterday I spoke to the Lebanese artist Marwan Rajmawi, and one of his works speaks so eloquently to the panel of today and ties those two together. So I would kindly like to ask you whether I can pull up this work, and then while you answer the questions, and then I'll share it when you're done answering the other question. Marwan Rajmawi.
So maybe I can address Huwaida, thank you so much. And you're someone who always reminds me that linearity can be quite, even if it's a philosophical thinking, but obviously it's also spatial. So thank you so much. And I completely agree. And this is in a way, yeah, as I said, we're launching from here, but we have to keep this in mind, absolutely, even as we develop the ideas. And the imaginaries is something that's definitely going to play a part in this. As for the experiential comment, actually, that's something we've been talking about. So you mentioned smell or other things. We've been talking about sound as another element of experience that we want to look into. And in some ways, actually, we've been, I forgot his first name, but Halprin, who's a very famous landscape architect, but he does this mapping, which he calls motations. And what it is, I think, is I think one time he mapped his wife, who's a ballet dancer, just moving around the space, and in some ways, the music or the dance or the other experiential senses actually mapped what space is, and and conveyed the relationships or the behaviors of space. So we are looking into definitely using different senses to try and map and understand space. We have to. If we're going through time, we obviously have to incorporate everything that happens in time. So this is in a way, absolutely, thank you for reminding us to talk about this. As for the differential identities of community, that area is not only about, there is Palestinians on one side and the Lebanese on the other side. There is an old Kurdish community that actually resides also in that area. And they probably exist, they've been here since the early 20s, so they probably existed before the camp. You could probably tell me more about this, actually. The Kurdish area, and they until now they've retained. They have they're woodworkers, or they work with wood, and they still have those spaces along that. So you have these interesting workshop spaces, that they have their own behavior that's going to play a part, and also you have. On the top edge, the image where it showed people sitting, behind it is actually sort of the newly Syrian inhabitants that came recently. And it really densified the area within 5 years to where you have buildings like 12 and 13 floors high. So you have different times of displacement that are existing in one space. One is hosting the other. I don't know who's hosting who, but that's in some ways, yes, of course, there's going to be differential identities and within the same community, because as soon as you reside in that space, you're no longer the Syrian or the Palestinian or the Lebanese. And so there's a lot of work to be done. But I absolutely agree with your both comments. It's things that we've, I think, felt, and you've emphasized it.
Okay, for the first question, when I was describing the camp in its social dimension and from the perception of the refugees, of course, because we were limited in time, it's not like to say that it's not a structure that is a power structure to control people, and it's a way of controlling the Jordanian border, and it's a way of controlling where people are located. It's a tool of control by the Jordanian authorities and by UNHCR, so it's not like being a neutral space. But I was like today pointing from a different perception. Where are the women in Zaatari? It's a good question. Well, nearly, I would say, everywhere. This is quite interesting because this was like something that have been also a question for the city nearby, Mafraq. You know that Mafraq, probably you don't know, but Mafraq is a very small city that is a rural city in northern Jordan, where there was more or less no activity or really social life outside the houses. And when the Syrians arrived after 2012, the city doubled in terms of inhabitants, and one of the first things that was a problem between the Jordanians and some of the Jordanians and the Syrian refugees was that the women were just walking around at night in groups of women walking around. That was like something that we used to do in Syria, and it was like something that was not really accepted by the Jordanian locals. So there was a complete change of the use of the urban space with the arrival of the Syrians. And I would say that in Zaatari it's exactly the same thing. First of all, there are two dimensions I think that are quite interesting. The first one is the the fact that they develop private spaces around the houses is one of the reasons is to protect kids that are just playing, but also to give a space, a private space for the women that spend most of the time at home, and especially because there is nothing else to do also. But also, we went from refugees coming from a rural background to something that is a city. So there are completely changes in the practices of the space by the Syrians, while the camp was developing, while new public spaces were developed, where new commercial areas developed, and suddenly, and step by step, I would say, there was a more presence of Syrians outside. And so the same kind of things happened, that what happened in Mafraq also happened inside Zaatari, where you find more and more women outside. And this urban dimension of the camp brought a lot of new social practices, and different kind of marriages, for example, occurred between people that would have never married in Syria because they were like in different social spaces. And that the fact that they were gathered in a single space that was not rural but urban completely changed also the patterns of marriages and social relation. So I would say that it's interesting to see how camp, that is power structure, that is here to control people, at certain point give some opportunities or changing in social practices. So this is quite interesting to see how crisis can contribute to bring some opportunities despite the constraints and the control. Difference between refugees themselves, and I think that yes, it's absolutely not a homogeneous perception, and all the refugees are not don't have the same background. And well, I would say that one of the most important difference that I have witnessed or seen in Jordan was those who were able to connect with local society through professional networks, through tribal networks, through whatever you want, and get out of the camp and be able to socialize in a different context. And those who were not able to do it and couldn't get outside of the camp. So there is this social background, there is forms of connections that we were able or not to do, was a very important thing in order in understanding the different trajectories, social trajectories of refugees after their arrival in Syria. And just a single word, a very short thing, on your comment. I think that one of the elements that was still understudied is the absence. And when you were talking about rights and political aspects, I think that the question of citizenship and the link to the fact that Syrians have contributed to build a city without any forms of citizenship. I mean, it's not their own city. They have absolutely no right as citizens, locally at least, to develop their political ideas. So this is quite interesting. So it's interesting to see that in the camp, all the forms of political organization have re-emerged, such as tribal organization, that has completely re-emerged with the shuyukh and the role of the imam, the role of the sheikh inside the camp, developed because of the lack of political representation. It's quite interesting if we compare it to the popular committee here in Lebanon in the Palestinian camp. It's also very interesting, I think, to have a comparison on this.
Okay, so I'll briefly tell you. Can you hear me? No? Okay, so I'll briefly tell you what you see here. I never know how to pronounce the abbreviation, UNRWA. Had this project where groups of residents in Palestinian camps were drawing their own environments according to age, gender, marital status, and so on. And so Marwan Rashmawi asked to use those drawings by residents. So this is one of them. And enlarge them and put them on materials that are also found in the camp. So this one is on concrete, and some of them are on corrugated iron. So this is another one. Let me see if I can find more. There it is. And so the reason why I thought it speaks so eloquently to these papers here is that on the one hand, there is this creative appropriation of space and the different ways in which they are given meaning and value by different residents and groups of residents of how it was planned or intended to be used, which also speaks to some of the other papers. At the same time, by making it bigger and using this more durable material, and by moving it into an art space, the artist is monumentalizing these more fleeting, perhaps, or informal imaginaries, perhaps. And deliberately so, which I think is also an interesting element in regards to the heritage panel that we heard today, where within heritage studies there's often kind of a suspicion of the monumental, and this artist also in his other works very deliberately monumentalizes precisely the fleeting and the informal and so on. Yeah, okay, just wanted to share that.
We still have 7 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to. I have a microphone. Okay, so it was very interesting to hear from Kamal in Zaatari camp, and then from Samar in Burj Al Baraj. It made me reflect a lot on the work we're doing also in Bar Ilyas on the types of housing, and I saw similar patterns and how people create these spaces of life, as Kamal called it, and I thought, like, when people shape and shape their spaces, whether it's in a tent or in a container or in a rented house, so like concrete, there's also like people are trying to be and to belong, but not too much as far as accepting that this is their identity and that's our situation. So there's always this notion of accepting the condition, and then it made me think of like the materials used, because of what Samar was saying, like how these materials are, the use of material. I noticed in Bar Ilyas there's always temporary material, even if the house changed. And what was interesting, when does the mattress that's on the floor becomes the bed? And that's also links to the cultural practices and the state of accepting the condition that the displaced or refugees live in. So I don't know, it just made me think of these notions, moving from Palestinian camp to Jordanian camp to informal settlements or rent or other types of housing that we saw in Lebanon. So thank you.
Thank you. I found it very helpful to have the chair's linking of this to personal identities. And this is because thinking about personal identity in relation to time and space, as you were saying, Samar, the past can be reconstructed, and there are many different kinds of ways of thinking about time on a personal basis. As those individuals look to the future, they must have a huge, sudden sense of uncertainty about their personal identity because they have so much less control than they have had before. So our personal identities surely embrace our future possibilities as well, and those possibilities have been really narrowed and limited hugely. So understanding one's personal identity in terms of one's own reconstruction of different stories, which can, of course, in some cases be therapeutic for people, and would that be therapeutic here? In relation to the future possibilities, which are now so much more narrow than they used to be, is that an aspect of the way in which we analyze time in this context? And is that, coming to Kamal's first presentation, is that why the private and the personal spaces are so important, the private and the social spaces that you have to then start creating become so important? And do these analyses that you're offering us enable those participants themselves to understand their own situation better? How do you use these to take their situation forward? So I suppose that's ultimately my question, but I thought reflecting on the personal identities was an interesting way of bringing those two very interesting talks together. Thank you.
Actually, here. You mentioned, Rohit, I think, mentioned the acts of talking about the sound. And we are doing the exercise of I'm working with Laboratoire Cresson at Grenoble, France, and we are studying actually Nahr el-Bared camp, the sound. We are working more on the sound, the sensory ambience, and we're working on how people are living now in the Nahr el-Bared camp after its reconstruction. And what we are doing, we are making more like collecting or recording the stories of those people. So we have kind of protocol, we call it méthode des itinéraires, when we are more focusing on hearing people and on hearing the sound of the camp, of its atmosphere. So for us, the photo cannot tell everything. Sometimes, as you said, women are everywhere. In the photos, we cannot see them. So we had the first movie, and there is lots of things you mentioned during your presentations about, for example, when one of the stories, she started the time of when they moved, 1948. And then she was linking the time to tell it's the space. So lots of the people, and what's important in the sound and those movies, that they are telling their stories and they are mentioning lots of things, and they're hearing the sound also of the environment within the voice of those refugees. So I would like to more talk about this exercise with you maybe in the break.
Last
question. Thank you very much for those presentations that take us across time and space. I just wanted to, I really like, Samar, what you did with the questioning about the sitting time. That was very poignant. And I wonder if Rancière is also helpful there, in the sense of, to whom is that time denied for collective gathering? And how is it controlled? And how is that resisted? And I think perhaps what Kamal, what you're saying about the social spaces and what Samar was saying about them, how is then that a form of resistance? I'm also thinking about, when is that moment of realization that you are staying for longer time, like the one you said, I think the example you gave is somebody eventually realized they would have done something different. And in these long, protracted situations that we have, particularly with camps with Palestinian people, when does that happen? Has it happened? Is there such a moment? Or does it never come? And how does it affect what happens socially? I'm just thinking partly from the context of Calais as well, where these social spaces got created incredibly quickly, in very, very different ways, depending on the community. And they were the reason that eventually the camp partly got shut down. So there was a real clash between the NGOs and everybody who was there who was trying to say, if we could just show that these spaces are important, they cannot possibly bulldoze the camp. When the judge came, the realization of those spaces was like, they're making a permanent settlement, we're getting rid of this. I mean, that's my summary interpretation. That's not exactly what was said, but there is that kind of clash. So I don't know if that's really a question, but thank you.
Just before Rabia turns over the floor to Samar and Kamal to react, I want to remind people that we are carrying on with this theme of rethinking the camp, which Kamal and Samar have done such a beautiful job with the film screening. 2 movies, My Very Private Map and Zinco by Subhi Zubaydi and Samar Hosni are exactly an extension of this discussion. Both movies are about representations of the camp, and they will be commented on by Professor Ricardo Bocco, whose presentation was moved to after the film screening. And I think this will be an extension of all the wonderful questions about time, memory, identity, mapping the camp, like Judith showed us. One of the movies is precisely about people of the camp mapping their own camp and what constructs there. So I want to remind people to attend that and use it as an extension of rethinking the camp theme. Thank you.
All right, let me try and remember. By the way, I am experiencing a shift in time as I came from the US, so I don't know if I'm 8 hours ahead or behind, sorry. Okay, maybe I can address Joanna's material transition, but I think you should elaborate on it more because, material is a very deceiving, in a way, actually, element to understand camps and displacements through. They're very important, but we have to really interrogate it a lot more because, as you said, at the end of the day, it's a personal also choice of what material settles you, let's say. Settles you internally and not settlement of the camp. It stops being a camp because there are beds and there's marble in the refugee camps, which you can find. The material is about maybe that micro scale of settlement, like the identity settlement, and this is more like the need, this unstable geography does have some stability in it in different forms, but I think they take different scales in nature. As for Diane's question, and I think this is something we're going to be debating a lot, the identity, the linearity, or time. Can we reconstruct? I don't think we can reverse time still, but can we reconstruct time? But the fact that we're saying reconstruct, there is a construction, which means there is a change. We can never reenact time or reenact a moment. And this is, as Palestinians, we actually grapple with a lot. And in some ways, the Israelis are better than us in always reminding us, Palestine is not the same anymore. You're not returning to Palestine. Again, perceptions. What is Palestine for you? What is Palestine for us? But I think it's a very important thing to highlight. Reconstruction does not mean, a reverse. And you start sort of from the familiar or that moment. Reconstruction is pretty much re-archiving in a way, as Lena presented the archive. It's sort of you are recollecting a history, but here it's a physical history, it's a identity history, but it's a recollection to construct. So this is how I see, why I say it's irreversible, or because we're definitely not treating it as we want to go back in time to the moment when there was harmony, when there was social harmony, or when there was. No, how can we use the past to inform the future? In a way. And then, should I continue with my answers in a way? Okay. And then the sitting time. Actually, that's a very interesting, you reminded me of a moment in Lebanon when, and this is before the 1969 Cairo Accords, which changed completely the nature of camps, because after the 1969 Accords, the Palestinians managed and operated the camps in Lebanon from that agreement. So pretty much, it went from a complete Lebanese presence of security, of management inside the camp, to them being outside the camp. They do not enter camps until today, unless, like in Nahr al-Barid, there is a moment of conflict. And we have to question why Nahr al-Barid was at that scale. But that's a different story. So during the time before '69, when the Lebanese security would enter camps and see 3 people standing or sitting, spending time together, that would be actually a point of where they have to disperse or they could get in trouble. Like they could be brought in and questioned. So there's that scale of 3 and more becoming a collective. What does that mean? Why are they scared of the collective scale in a space like the camp early on? Is because, of course, there are spaces of violence. These people are in these spaces awaiting a political resolution before an identity or anything else. So the politics of these spaces will never leave. It will never, be erased. It will change. Again, reconstruction. But it remains a politically binded space, whether it's the Palestinian or the Syrian. But it would definitely take different forms. Because of the origin of the moment you origin from as time of conflict, and also because of the host geography plays a big part of this. So when do these moments of social time start being constructed? It's from the moment you leave your home, actually. People, and a lot of people wrote about these social formations through oceans. People start creating their social groups in the diaspora or in the displacement as soon as they leave. People gather along, let's say, with people from the same area or people from the same village. And then the family with the majority of members would probably become the Mukhtar family. They would become sort of the de facto, or they would take forms, just like they take physical forms reconstructing villages, they reconstruct social relations as well. So in Baqa camp, the Hdeb family from in one of the areas has always been the Mukhtar family in the village in Dawaime, and in Baqa they still are. So those, of course, these forms are, because these forms existed on also serious, social and material formations, they don't just disappear. They get reconstructed, but they're not the same as the previous. And this is why I'm saying reconstruction, not a reenactment in a way. So I think they're constructed before they even arrive to the camp, the moments of social time. And that's why there is a surprise for us, how did they happen so quickly?
Extremely briefly. Well, I think that what you said about destruction of camps, as soon as it becomes like permanent, and the way to connect social forms, I mean social organization, and how it's transcripted into social is very important. In Zaatari, there is a fight, a real fight between the dwellers and the international organization and the Jordanian authorities in order to prevent any form of self-organization of the space, and they try as long as they can to recreate and to reshape the space according to like security standards in order to prevent any kind of fire, for example. They're just removing some space, transforming it in order to discipline the people. So of course there is a will and a real political in this, in shaping the space, and to try to, I mean, the refugees, they resist through dwelling, and the authorities, they resist through destroying and disciplining the space. And last thing, in what we bring to the refugees, I mean, what we try to take from our experience, because we work with a very limited number of refugees, but on 3 years, so we were really trying to construct with them knowledge. It's interesting because we were really looking at how do they develop skills. And we discovered that some of them never built a house before. Some of them did, but they were mostly outside of the camps. And they were self-construction in Syria before in informal areas, most of them. But in the camp, it was like a little bit different from rural areas. And it was interesting to try to understand how do they develop skills. How do they acquire skills in shaping something that they never thought before? So it was interesting to see how did they try to find solutions with very limited available material and with high constraints. So it was interesting to, I mean, the overall discussion. So we were drawing the maps. I was not doing it, but the architects were doing it. And we were going back to them and reshaping the maps with them and working. So there was a real exchange. Information back with them and discussions was like much more posing, research and leaving. So.
Okay, thank you for an amazing panel, and definitely from most of the audience have stayed almost 2 hours now. So definitely, it's been a brilliant also discussion. Thank you both. Thank you.